And so, as I said before, we'll look at some practice questions at the beginning of the day and continue with the with the review session. Well, the allegory of the cave, of course, is a story that we said has two major interpretations. One, as it reflects on what your author calls the critical function of philosophy. And when we say critical, we're not using that in a negative way, but it's the analytic function of philosophy. So you need to think in terms of constructive criticism. And there's also an interpretation of the allegory that relates to Plato's specific theory of the forms. And we may or may not get to both today, but so I want to start reviewing. I'm not going to get through the entire review sheet, but I'd like to get through its allegory and the theory of forms. So obviously the prisoner's situation then is that they've been in the cave their whole lives, or almost all their lives. They basically are chained, and of course the important point to emphasize about what the prisoners are wearing are that they have their head and neck chained so that they're forced to look and face the back wall, and what's in front of them on the back wall are shadows cast by objects behind them, and there's a fire behind them that casts the shadows.
So you said they're wearing head and neck chains?
Yeah, in other words, their head and their necks are chained so that the only thing they are acquainted with are the shadows on the wall, right? And the shadows on the wall then become their reality. It's what they've known all of their lives. When they see a shadow pass, they think these are the real things. And they also, even when they hear a voice, don't think it's coming from somebody walking on the path behind them or from one of the other prisoners, but they think that the voice is coming from the shadows, that it's the shadows that are talking.
All right, just before we move on, can you explain to me one more time what is allegory?
Well, it basically is a story where items in the story are meant to represent other things. And allegory is the best name for this. Some textbooks call it a parable, but in a technical sense, it's not a parable. And it certainly is not a myth. It's not part of the mythology.
So it's symbolic, basically?
Yeah, in other words, that's the whole point of the story, is that items in the story represent other specific items. And as I said, there are two interpretations. One, it represents things when we're talking about the critical function of philosophy in making us confront our unreflective, culturally conditioned beliefs, the beliefs we've soaked up from our surrounding culture and that we have accepted as true and good beliefs, often without asking why. And so, just as the prisoners in the cave have been culturally conditioned to think of the shadows as the most real things, And of course, Plato portrays them as having bad beliefs about that. So we have been bombarded all of our lives with
Different allegories, symbols.
well, with philosophical opinions. Hold on, let me. The last page of your handout, I put this this handout. So as regards the critical function of philosophy, and this is where it really limits you not having the mic. So the cave represents the cultural environment that we grew up in. And we're not reading this into Plato. One interpretation Plato had of this story is that it's a story about how philosophy gets you to challenge uncritically accepted beliefs, as Socrates challenged the uncritically accepted beliefs of his fellow Athenians about justice, about whether knowledge was possible, whether inquiry was possible, about belief or non-belief in the gods. Remember the story of Socrates' friend Chaerephon, who goes to the oracle at Delphi. An oracle is a prophetess, in this case, who speaks supposedly for a god. The oracle of Delphi supposedly spoke directly for the god Apollo. And Chaerephon, Socrates' friend, learns from the oracle that Socrates is the wisest man. And Socrates says, when he hears this story, I don't feel particularly wise. He says, well, I need to challenge this and see if I can find somebody wiser in my own culture. And then I can say, well, look, you said I was the wisest person, and here's this other person who's clearly wiser than I am. So Socrates says he starts out confronting people about their beliefs and what they thought was true. And the first group, one of the first people was from the group of politicians. Now, we don't have any politicians nowadays who don't know what they're talking about, but nonetheless claim to be very wise and knowledgeable and people we ought to listen to. We don't have any people like that today, but in Socrates' day we did. No, you know I'm being facetious. We certainly have people like that today, right? And Socrates says he chatted with this politician for a while about a number of different things. And he did this with many other politicians, but he relates this in his trial. And he says, I came away from that discussion feeling like neither one of us knew much of anything worthwhile. But he said, if I was wiser than the politician, it was in this that I at least didn't claim to know things that I didn't know anything about, like the politician did. And so Socrates gives this ironic definition of wisdom as knowing that you don't know, and that you need to inquire into things, and not just taking what you've always believed as, the truth of the matter. So Socrates then is the person who confronts the prisoner, the released prisoner, but also anyone who's a teacher in philosophy. So the prisoners then in the cave represent us. You say, I've never been in a cave before. but you've been in a cultural environment where you've soaked up beliefs from your schooling, from the classes you took, from the textbooks you read. You've soaked them up from the media, from television you watched, from books or articles or comic books you read, right? From songs you listened to, movies. You've soaked up beliefs, from your religious background. And Socrates says, the prisoners are like us in that, like his fellow Athenians, we grow up in a cultural environment and just assume various things are true without questioning them. What philosophy challenges us to do, and this is what turning around the released prisoner is forced to confront his uncritically accepted beliefs. Now, right now, we're not worried about what's in the third column here. And the reasons for those uncritically accepted beliefs. So, the released prisoner's guide is the philosopher who gets them to confront them. Socrates also confronted the craftspeople, the technical people of his own day, and Socrates himself was trained as a stonemason, though commentators disagree as to whether they think he ever actually made a living as one. And Socrates says, well, sure, in their own narrow technical area they knew more than I did, but they took the fact that they had expertise in a narrow technical area, and they thought that it made them wise generally about many things outside of their area, where, again, they didn't know what they were talking about when I really questioned them. And so Socrates says I was wiser than them in the same way that I didn't claim to know things I didn't know. Likewise, the poets and the writers of dramatic works, tragedies, etc., were venerated in Athens as knowledgeable, wise people. Socrates takes some of the poems that the poets wrote to them, and they supposedly wrote their poems by inspiration, and so they couldn't even explain their own poems. And yet they took the fact that they were accomplished in a particular artistic area to mean that they can give opinions about a lot of other things outside of their own art. And of course this happened in Socrates' day. It isn't that we have well-known sports figures or actors coming on late-night talk shows telling us what we ought to believe about animal rights or about saving the planet from global warming or about eating meat and the ethics of that. It isn't that we have people like that nowadays who think that because they're good athletes or good actors that they know things about a lot of other areas, where they really may not know what they're talking about. But again, in Socrates' day, this happened. So the journey of a released prisoner then is supposedly one toward knowledge. And here the idea is that we, when we sift through our beliefs, the assumption going on in the back of all this is that the best beliefs to hold, the ones that are most likely to be true, are the ones for which we can give the best reasons, the best supporting evidence. And that's why Socrates says, well, okay, you've soaked up a lot of beliefs, but ask yourself, well, what are the reasons I have for this is what I've always believed? What are my reasons for believing this? I've just soaked it up because it's what other people in my culture believe. Now note, this is not a relativistic view, right? Socrates and Plato are not defending cultural relativism, the view that truth is determined by the beliefs of one's own culture, and neither was Dr. King. If Dr. King was a cultural relativist, he should have been out there defending the segregationist laws of the culture that he was in, instead of challenging them. This thing will wake up in a minute. And so that's what's kind of the critical function of philosophy then, is the analytic function, the function that asks us to examine our own beliefs, the reasons for them, and the most fundamental concepts. A lot of Plato's dialogues, and here we go into the theory of the forms. By the way, scratch out this practical consequence of the problem of free will. That was just a cut and paste error. That there was a time when we used to cover free will much earlier in the semester than we do now. So Plato's forms, this is the other interpretation of the allegory. It's supposed to be a story that represents the various aspects of things in Plato's own two-tier theory of reality. You know, again, if you miss a lecture, there's a PowerPoint on this, there's a lecture. Integrity courses on it. What's Plato's view of opinion versus knowledge? First of all, some of the things that we claim to know, particular facts. I know the Orioles lost the game last night. I know there's a briefcase sitting there. I know that Glass's case is blue. We use the word know, but for Plato, real knowledge is not about particular facts in the world. Real knowledge is about lasting eternal truths. So when Socrates and Plato argue that we have innate knowledge, that we come in this world knowing some things already, like Meno Slave Boy does, they're not claiming that we come into the world knowing particular facts, that we come into the world knowing that in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? But what passes for genuine knowledge for Plato is knowledge of what is unchanging and eternal and lasting. And these for Plato are the forms. About things in this world we can have only opinion. That's because, I mean, things that are matter of opinion may be true today, false tomorrow, right? It's true right now that there's a coffee cup sitting on the audio-visual table, right? And now it's false that there's a coffee cup sitting on the audio-visual table. What was true a few minutes ago is now false. Plato doesn't think fleeting things like that in this world deserve the name knowledge. What deserves the name knowledge are lasting things like, say, the principles of Euclidean geometry. That, you know, the truths of geometry are always going to be true. You know, it's always going to be true that if you want to build a square twice the size of a given square, you build it on the diagonal. And of course, that'll be one of the things we'll have you to do, is to write out that geometric proof on test 1. the proof that Socrates draws in the sand. No, I'm only kidding, right? If you did your time in plane geometry in high school, we're not going to ask you to do any more. But let's talk about what knowledge is knowledge of then. Knowledge is of eternal things like the truths of geometry. In other words, Socrates claims that Meno, slave boy who's never been taught geometry, nonetheless knows these truths. Socrates is reacting in part to some very skeptical philosophers of his day, very cynical people called sophists, who tried to use what was called the paradox of inquiry to argue that we're never going to know anything and it's not worthwhile inquiring into the nature of anything. That's not what the philosopher ought to be looking for, is knowledge and truth. Because they argued, well, look, either you know what you're looking for already, in which case it's pointless to inquire into it because you already know it, or if you don't know it, they say, well, how do you even know where and how to begin an inquiry? And suppose you find what you're looking for in terms of what you don't know, how are you going to know it or recognize it when you find it? So why inquire in the nature of anything? Well, Socrates uses this view of saying, look, we do have some knowledge already, but it's knocked into a latent state when our body becomes, or when our soul becomes reincarnated in this present body. Now, they argue for reincarnation, but note, I mean, that's accepting a pretty hefty metaphysical view about the nature of reality, right? That we have an immaterial mortal soul, and that we not only have such a soul, but that it gets recycled through bodies. But this is the view that Plato and Socrates argued for, right? I'm not asking you to accept that view, but just to try to understand it, understand where they're coming from. So what he's trying to say is this knowledge of eternal truths gets knocked into a latent state when, because it's so shocking for a soul to become reincarnated in a new body. He actually argues this in the Phaedo, one of Plato's dialogues. And what we need to do is to ask questions that bring out this knowledge. How's the boy brought from opinion to knowledge? By Socrates asking questions. Now see, today, when professors or teachers talk about, oh, well, I used the Socratic method with my students in class this morning, well, what they mean is they're asking them some questions to try to bring out stuff in what they hopefully read the night before. But the real Socratic method, Socrates was trying to bring out knowledge of eternal truths that are supposedly deep in our souls from birth.
But isn't that a way of him just coaching the slave boy, because he coached him into the answer that he wanted from him?
Well, see, that's enough. Let's suppose that actually happened, that the whole scene actually happened. That's an alternative interpretation about what's going on there, right? That the boy simply used his powers of reasoning to get the answer right, that he's not recalling something that his soul knew prior to this birth.
Because if you remember,
right, because we saw his argument, right? Socrates' argument is, well, the boy's a slave boy. There's no public education in ancient Greece, right? As the son of a carpenter, I told you, I know geometry because we have a public education system here, right? But Socrates says, well, how is it that he can get stuff right? He either he learned it in this life, or he must have learned it in a previous life. He's a slave boy, so we know he didn't learn it in this life. He must have learned it in a previous life. But you can say, well, wait a second. Couldn't he simply be reasoning things out from the diagram that's right in front of him? Yeah. In other words, Plato doesn't sufficiently eliminate the other possible explanations for what's going on there. So Socrates' argument in the end is not the best argument. It's what in logic we call a false dilemma. That is, presenting two choices as the only options available, eliminating one and focusing on the other and say, well, it's not A, so it must be B, when really there's A, B, C, D, several options, but you only presented two in your argument, and so it's a bad argument, right? Because you ignored the other possibilities. No, that's a legitimate question to raise about what's going on there. But understand what Socrates is saying here is, since the slave boy didn't learn it here, he must learn it when his soul was apart from his body. That is, his soul must have been acquainted with the eternal forms, the eternal truths of geometry, before it became incarnated in this present body. So Plato thinks that our souls can actually be in this unseen world where the forms are. So what are the forms in relation to those objects of which they are the forms? Well, they're the standards of which the other objects are only the copies. And so a good way that philosophers have explained this since I was in college and considerably is to think of a blueprint. You could have a blueprint for a home and build many homes using the same blueprint as the standard. Well, the form of deskness is the blueprint for every desk in this world. Things in this world for Plato are a combination of immaterial forms, like the form of deskness, and matter. If I drew a triangle, in this world it's a combination of the immaterial standard or blueprint or form of triangularity plus the chalk with which I draw the triangle, the matter. Tell me these things aren't self-aware, and they're also evil. See, Plato thought the material world was evil, so we have the computer conspiring to do us in here. And it's not even giving me back the document that I was on.
Because it's telling you rewind just a little bit. Can we just go back over the first beginning so we can make sure everyone has it?
Well, I mean,
Please, sir, we need that. So exactly, okay. So when we answer these questions,
so
when we answer these questions, are we going to answer these questions such as what do they actually wear, what their vision is limited to? We're going to
okay. As I said, I'm going to give you some
ladies, y'all
sample questions to give you an idea of how I ask a question on Friday, and that'll tell you more about the question you're asking now, But these are not going to be short answer. But what I'm saying is, if you acquaint yourself with the topics here, you should be well prepared to be able to answer, objective questions on these. So, let's see. Okay. The arguments for the forms are a big part of the focus of that PowerPoint. As I said, the PowerPoint was not structured, not made from Solomon's exposition of it, but from another text. Solomon doesn't go into these arguments as much. So you want to look at the PowerPoint if you don't know. So the name of the argument that claims that in other words, these are arguments meant to answer the question, well, why should I think these eternal objects are there to begin with? Well, one of Plato's main answers is, if knowledge is going to be of what is stable and unchanging and eternal, then it has to be knowledge of things that are stable and unchanging and eternal, like the forms. Okay? What a triangle is for Plato an eternal standard. Similarly for things like justice or what a human being is. So the epistemological argument, I'm not going to answer that name, but it says that in order for true knowledge to be possible, and knowledge for Plato, as we said, is of what is unchanging and eternal, it has to have objects that fit the bill, and it's only the forms that fit that bill. And they're also perfect. The metaphysical argument for the forms basically says that the forms need to be there because they are shared characteristics that more than one thing shares. In other words, it says that if two things share a common characteristic, like two chairs share chairness, two squares share squareness, then there must actually exist that characteristic that they share. So if two particular triangles share triangularity, then triangularity has to exist apart from and independent of the particulars. So for Plato, there's a form that's a perfect standard for what a desk is that exists eternally, independent of any particular desk, and it is what all desks have in common. Right? So, let's see. Now, the semantic argument for the forms, again, these are in the PowerPoint. Basically, semantics has to deal with the meaning and reference of words. The forms particular forms can be spoken of for Plato in the singular. In other words, besides triangularity as a general concept, there is the form of a triangle or the triangle. In other words, it's like there's one triangle that's a standard, one perfect triangle that's a standard for all triangles. And because you can speak of the forms as being like singular objects, general words like triangle or triangularity that apply to more than one specific triangle have the word, that general word, as their proper name. In other words, triangle or triangularity singles out the form of a triangle in the same way that if we named a particular triangle, we would single out just one particular triangle. Or humanness singles out the form of being human in just the way that the proper name Victor Morawski singles out one individual human being. So it says that general words are the proper names of forms, is what it's getting at there. Now, I'm not going to worry about the divided line, but basically, the shadows on the wall are images. They are copies of the objects behind them, right? And similarly, an artistic representation of, say, a desk or a statue would be an image of it, or a reflection of it in a mirror or in water. For Plato, the shadows are copies of copies. What they think is most real are very far removed from reality, images of things. The copies are material objects that, remember, inside the cave represents this world. The fire in the cave represents the sun in this world. The objects people are carrying represent material objects. But a particular desk is but an imperfect copy of the perfect form of a desk in the world of the forms. A particular triangle is an imperfect copy of the triangle. And so for Plato, then, objects in this world aren't even the most real things. This is why it's so hard, and students get questions wrong all the time because they cannot think like Plato. Plato's trying to turn on its head your conception of what is real and my conception of what is real. Right? We've been conditioned to think like my geometry teachers at Poly. There are no such things as perfect triangles. So if we're going to talk about a perfect triangle, my geometry teachers at Poly said, well, think of a perfect triangle, think of an imaginary triangle with perfect sides and perfect angles. It doesn't exist any more than a unicorn exists. But it's a mental construction. Plato's trying to convince you that a perfect triangle, the perfect triangle, the form of a triangle, not only exists, but exists more fully than any particular triangle in this world. Why? Because it's an eternal, unchanging object that will never change its essential nature, never came into existence, will never go out of existence, whereas a particular triangle comes into and goes out of existence. So for Plato, then, you and I are like the prisoners in the cave, and we think, along with Madonna, since we're living in the material world, right? And we're material boys and girls here, I include myself among that. We think these things are the most real things. Plato's going to say, no, the form of a desk is much more real than this desk that you can see and feel and touch. That's why Plato is so hard to understand, because he knows he's turning on its head what you think is most real, right? And so we're, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So for the assignment that's due on Monday on the day of the test, could I email a copy of what I have already typed up so that you can
Actually, I'm glad you asked that, because I meant to make that point. Part of my job is to look over drafts, but I will tell you, let me make a qualification. Because I've already had some drafts sent to me from one of my Essex classes that has their test tomorrow morning. No, that had their test yesterday. And they sent me, and if you send it in 365, I may or may not be able to give you a comment, because I had to go through 15 minutes setting up my phone with passwords and all that just so I could look at what she sent me on the phone, and the passwords and all that I set up don't work for the computer. So I gotta look and see if I can even set it up. You know, this is so new that ordinarily I should be able to at least send you some comments on a draft, but don't wait till 10 o'clock, Sunday night to send it, okay? Yeah.
So, on the paper it says open book, open book, so you think that was for the assignment, not the test, right?
Right. The essay is open book, open notes, because what else can it be?
Right.
But I'm testing big concepts that I'd like you to carry away in your head from the course on the objective, so it's closed book, closed notes. And again, you want to get your Scantron form if you haven't already done it. And bring a number 2 pencil. I'll have some, but the one way to make sure that you've got a good one is to bring your own. Okay? And we'll continue Friday with it.
What is the test? Is it the one the test?